The snow had started falling softly by noon, feathering the streets and windowsills in a white hush that felt almost holy. Inside the kitchen, the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic drifted through the house, mingling with cinnamon from the pies cooling on the counter. My hands moved with practiced ease, carving, basting, folding, pouring. Everything had to be perfect. It was my first Christmas hosting since buying the house last spring. A modest 3-bedroom in the suburbs, not ostentatious, but warm mine. I had saved for nearly a decade, sacrificing vacations, nights out, and comfort, funneling every extra dollar into the down payment. When Mom's house started falling apart from years of deferred maintenance, crumbling drywall, a leaking roof, ancient wiring, I'd stepped in. Quietly, dutifully. $50,000 later, she could celebrate the holidays without fearing a fire or flood. She never said thank you. I opened the kitchen window to let the steam out and the crisp December air in. That's when I heard them. My sister Amanda's voice first, sharp with disdain. "I can't believe we're celebrating with that loser." The breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. Surely not. But then came Mom's reply, casual as if discussing the weather. "Only until she pays for the house repairs." My fingers curled around the windowsill. "I'm ready to take her share too," Amanda added with a laugh, the sound cruel and light, like breaking glass in the snow. I stood there, frozen. The roast in the oven needed checking. The cranberry glaze needed stirring. But all I could hear was the sound of their voices, my mother and sister, talking about me as if I were currency, not kin. I closed the window gently. Slowly, the same way you might close the lid on a casket. Then I turned back to the stove with a smile so radiant you'd never know it was forged in fire. They came in hours later, cheeks red from the cold and laughter, complimenting the decorations, the scent of dinner, the matching gold and burgundy place settings. Amanda handed me a bottle of wine I'd bought myself on her behalf. She forgot, again. Mom commented on how nice it was that someone had finally learned to host properly. I served them all with grace. Poured wine, cut slices of prime rib, passed sides with a soft, "here you go," and a quieter, "you're welcome," that no one acknowledged. 7 days later, everything changed. But not because of revenge. Not because I slammed doors or screamed accusations. No, that would have only fed their narrative. Emotional, dramatic, overreacting. Words they reserved for me when I had the audacity to express hurt. Instead, I did what I've always done. I listened, I calculated, and I moved with precision. The morning after Christmas, I took stock. Not of gifts or leftovers, but of the balance sheet between my heart and theirs. It read like a ledger of unreciprocated sacrifice. For years, I'd told myself that helping them meant I was kind, that loving them through their carelessness made me strong. But that window had shattered something. Not just the illusion of family, but the permission I'd given them to siphon pieces of me without consent. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, replaying their voices in my head. Amanda, always the performer. Our mother, ever the audience. I'd spent most of my life behind the curtain, setting the stage for their comfort. A stack of unopened mail caught my eye. I thumbed through it distractedly, credit card offers, year-end sales, a thank you note from the contractor I'd hired for Mom's repairs. He'd written, "You're the reason this house stands strong." I folded that card and tucked it into my wallet. That afternoon, I made calls. Quiet, professional calls. I contacted my accountant, then my attorney. I reviewed every transfer I'd made to Mom's house, every contract I'd signed, every financial thread that tied me to their needs. I was methodical. Because this time, my giving would have boundaries and an end. On the 7th day, I sent 3 letters by certified mail. The first was to Amanda. It contained a summary of every loan she'd begged for and never repaid. Clothes for job interviews, 2 months' rent after her failed startup, that bail she'd never mentioned to our mother. I requested repayment, not to reclaim the money, but to reclaim my dignity. The second letter went to my mother. It included a full accounting of the $50,000 I'd spent on her home, every invoice, receipt, and bank transfer. At the bottom I wrote, "This was a gift made in love. It will be the last." The third letter was to my bank, revoking co-authorization on the emergency credit card they routinely used in my name. That card was cut in half before I sealed the envelope. I did not include explanations. I owed none. That evening, Amanda called 6 times in a row. I didn't answer. The 7th time, she left a voicemail laced with fury. "How dare you treat us like this after all we've done for you?" I listened once, deleted it, then opened a bottle of wine, one I had bought for myself, just because I deserved something soft after something hard. As I sipped, I stared out the window I'd once closed on their betrayal. The snow had melted into slush. The world looked a little less perfect, but more honest. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt entirely, beautifully alone. The voicemails multiplied like weeds, first Amanda, then my mother, then even Aunt Jean, whom I hadn't spoken to since Easter 3 years ago when she'd accidentally compared my dating life to a used car lot. Each message varied in tone. Some pleaded, others scolded. But they all had one thing in common, a deep bewilderment that I'd finally drawn a line. They weren't prepared for boundaries. For so long, I'd been their silent investor, the unpaid emotional accountant who patched up financial leaks and bruised egos without complaint. "What's gotten into you?" Amanda texted. The question made me laugh aloud, as if my voice were some foreign substance, an infection that needed diagnosis. What had gotten into me? Peace. That's what. The kind that comes when you've run out of roles to perform in a play that was never written for you. The kind of peace that feels like exhaling after years of shallow breathing. I didn't respond to their messages, not out of spite but protection. My therapist, who I'd only begun seeing in the fall, once told me, when you stop participating in your own exploitation, people mistake it for hostility. Let them misunderstand. I returned to my work that week, designing financial plans for clients who actually valued my expertise. I met a friend for lunch and told her everything between bites of warm tomato soup. She reached across the table and held my hand without offering platitudes. "You didn't imagine any of it," she said softly. "And you don't have to justify walking away." Later that night, as the house settled into its own quiet, I looked through old photo albums. The kind filled with stiff smiles at birthdays, orchestrated moments of happiness framed by expectations. In almost every picture, I was holding something: plates, purses, crying toddlers. Always serving. Always useful. I closed the album. Then I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, in pen that didn't smudge, I wrote, "This year, I stopped proving my worth to people who have no intention of valuing it." The next morning, I booked a solo trip to Scotland. I'd always wanted to see the Highlands in winter. The vast, windswept solitude felt like the perfect place to begin again. When I texted Amanda to say I wouldn't be attending Mom's birthday dinner, she responded in less than a minute. Unbelievable. Selfish, as always. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of speech. It's a sanctuary. A boundary. A beginning. The weeks that followed were strangely light. My shoulders, unburdened of invisible obligations, began to square naturally. I walked taller. Slept deeper. Smiled for no reason at all. At work, I proposed a restructuring plan that got immediate traction. My ideas, once quietly borrowed and presented by louder voices, were now credited to me directly. I spoke more in meetings, hesitated less when my insight could change a strategy. My manager noticed. "You've changed," she said one Friday as we wrapped up a client proposal. "I've come home to myself," I replied, before I even realized the words were mine. That weekend, I began decluttering, first the hall closet, then drawers, then digital archives. Old emails from Amanda requesting money. Notes from my mother, full of passive praise. "We're lucky you're so strong," she'd once written after I'd covered her dental bill. Strong was their euphemism for exploitable. I deleted them all. Then I opened my banking app and renamed one of my savings accounts, Joy Fund. Not for emergencies. Not for someone else's rent or broken water heater. For me. For art classes. For spontaneous trips. For the little cafe I dreamed of opening someday, the one with bookshelves, local art, and soft jazz floating through the air. On Sunday, I bought a cherry wood frame and hung that contractor's thank you card in my hallway. A small reminder. I build things that last, even when no one says thank you. 2 days later, Amanda emailed me a forwarded message from our mother titled Urgent. Their HVAC had broken. Repairs would be $8,000. Amanda had scrawled at the top, "Thought you'd want to help. It's still Mom's house." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I made tea. The kind I used to save for special occasions. And I drank it while reading a novel by the window, the same one I had once closed to muffle their betrayal. The HVAC repair would come. Maybe they'd borrow. Maybe Amanda would finally dip into her own earnings instead of mine. Maybe they'd sell something, feel discomfort, face accountability. But I would not save them. Not this time. Because I had finally learned the truth. They weren't counting on my generosity. They were counting on my guilt. And guilt, like debt, is only owed if you agree to it. One evening in early February, I walked through the house with bare feet, letting the warmth from the floorboards press gently into my skin. The quiet hum of my space filled the air, not silence, not emptiness, but the soft murmur of peace. I passed by the guest room where Amanda had once stayed after one of her breakups, sobbing into my linens and eating the groceries I had just bought. I had held her hair back as she cried over someone she'd known for 3 months. She never asked about my own heartbreaks. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a document titled Reclamation. In it, I began to write not for anyone else, not for approval, but for myself. Each paragraph was a piece of the puzzle I'd hidden away to survive. Memories surfaced like old photographs tucked in dusty drawers. I remembered the Christmas when I was 12, when Amanda got a camcorder, and I received a sweater 3 sizes too big. She needed it more, Mom had said, not even glancing my way. The story wrote itself. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. A few days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. From my mother. "I don't know what you're trying to prove by cutting us off. Amanda and I have always needed you. Isn't that what family is? Being needed?" I reread it several times, the words dense with the weight of assumption. Not a single question about how I felt. Not one acknowledgement of what she'd said on Christmas Day. The next morning, I visited my therapist and read the letter aloud. When I finished, she looked at me with gentle eyes and said, "They want you back in the role, not in the relationship." That sentence lived with me. Back in the role. The fixer. The giver. The one who bends so others can stretch. Not anymore. That weekend, I hosted a dinner for 3 close friends, the kind of chosen family I'd spent years quietly wishing for. We cooked together, laughed without pretense, and toasted to small victories. I shared my plans to apply for a business grant to finally start my cafe. Amanda called during dessert. I let it ring. Let it go to voicemail. Let it stay there. As my friends left that night, one of them paused at the door and said, "You look like you own this space, not just the house, but your whole life." And in that moment, I did. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange elegance, slow mornings filled with purpose, quiet evenings bathed in the amber light of self-trust. It wasn't that life had become perfect. It was simply mine. The calls from Amanda and Mom grew less frequent, though their tone shifted with each voicemail, from outrage to guilt to forced sweetness. The last message I received came on the eve of Amanda's birthday. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "Mom's depressed. I hope you're happy." The unspoken ending lingered. As always, come back and fix it. Instead, I mailed Amanda a birthday card. Inside, I wrote only 6 words. "I hope you find your mirror." It wasn't meant as cruelty. It was a wish. That one day, she'd stop taking from her reflection in others and learn to see herself. I knew then I wouldn't hear from them again for a while. And I was at peace with that. In early March, I stood outside a storefront downtown. It was small, with scuffed floors and sun-streaked windows, but I saw past the dust. I saw shelves of books, tables with steaming mugs, the flicker of candlelight during evening readings. The owner was retiring. I had met her by accident at a networking brunch, and when I told her about my cafe dream, she smiled. "This place deserves someone who's loved something harder than it's loved them back," she said. "It deserves someone who'll pour their whole heart into it. Like you." We struck a deal by handshake and ink. The deposit came from the Joy Fund. That evening, I sat on the wooden floor of what would become the hearth. I watched the sunset pour its honey light through the windows, and I thought about all the things I used to beg my family for: love, validation, attention, and how none of them mattered now that I had given those things to myself. The next day, I started renovations. My hands ached, my arms sore, and I felt more alive than I ever had in a house filled with cold politeness and invisible bruises. I wasn't fixing anyone else's home now. I was building my own. Every wall I sanded, every paint stroke I laid inside the hearth, felt like I was rewriting an old story, one where I was no longer the background character to everyone else's spotlight. The renovation process was grueling, but it was honest work. Tangible. For once, the energy I gave returned to me through progress I could see. Exposed beams turned elegant, dusty corners made warm with soft lighting, and shelves that would soon cradle stories from floor to ceiling. Each morning I arrived before sunrise, the cold air reminding me I was doing something bold, brave, borderless. In the quiet hours before the contractors arrived, I brewed coffee on a camping stove and wrote in a worn leather journal I kept behind the counter. That journal became a vessel for reflections, dreams, and memories I needed to release. I wrote about the year Amanda borrowed my savings and promised to pay me back in 3 months. It took 3 years, and only after our aunt shamed her into it. I wrote about the way Mom smiled for photos during holidays, then sighed, "You've always been so serious," when I didn't laugh loud enough to fill the room. But I also wrote about the morning sunlight in my new shop, and how it reminded me of the way Grandma's kitchen used to glow before breakfast. There were good memories too. They just hadn't lived in that house. By April, word had spread about the hearth. I posted progress photos online, and locals began stopping by, curious. Some dropped off books to donate, others brought plants, and one woman, who lived across the street, gifted me a hand-woven welcome mat. "It's time someone brought something warm to this block," she said. The irony wasn't lost on me, strangers offering warmth in ways my own blood never had. One afternoon, as I was arranging a reading nook near the front window, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was my mother. Her voice was soft. Not sad. Just tired. "I drove by the other day. The shop looks beautiful. I hope you're well. No requests. No guilt. No Amanda in the background." Just those 2 sentences. I sat down, not because I was shaken, but because something subtle inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I simply whispered, "Thank you," to the empty room. Sometimes people don't have to change for you to heal. Sometimes the healing comes when you realize their change is no longer your responsibility. May brought a quiet bloom of joy, flowers in window boxes, the scent of new books, the hum of belonging. The hearth opened on the first Saturday of the month, doors wide, coffee brewing, every table adorned with fresh violets and handwritten quotes tucked under sugar jars. The first customers were strangers. By the end of the week, they were familiar faces. Teachers grading papers with cappuccinos. Artists sketching in the afternoon light. A teenager who sat in the corner with the same mystery novel for 3 days straight and finally asked if I had the sequel. Word spread fast. But what surprised me most was not the community's embrace. It was how naturally I embraced them back. I, the so-called cold one in my family, the serious sister, now remembered names, asked about days, tucked cinnamon sticks in regulars tea just because I knew they liked it. One Thursday evening, as we hosted our first open mic night, I stepped up to the microphone to welcome the crowd. My voice didn't shake. It rang clear, anchored not in fear, but in the foundation I had built from scratch. This space, I said, was born from silence. Mine, mostly. But now it's for every voice that was once too soft, too strange, too easily dismissed. Applause. Not thunderous, but full, real. The next day, a card arrived. Handwritten. From my mother. It read, "Your shop is lovely. Amanda is struggling, but I won't ask you to come back. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if I made you feel unseen. I see you now. I hope it's not too late." I folded the card neatly. I didn't cry. My heart didn't race. It simply settled like snow after a storm. That night, I lit a candle in the shop's window. Just one. Not an invitation, not a signal. Just light. Mine. Because forgiveness is not a door you reopen. It's a path you walk alone, sometimes lit only by your own courage. Summer came like a balm, warm and healing. The hearth thrived in the longer days, its windows wide open, letting in breeze and conversation. Children sat cross-legged for story time, couples sipped cold brew over poetry, and the scent of lavender lemonade floated through the air like a hymn. One Sunday, as I was adjusting the chalkboard menu outside, I saw her, Amanda, standing across the street in dark sunglasses and a familiar dress I had once loaned her, never returned, never thanked for. Her posture was uncertain. She looked thinner than I remembered. Or maybe just smaller. I didn't wave. I didn't hide. I simply stood there, my hands chalk-smudged, my apron dusted with flour, and waited to see what she'd do. She crossed the street. The doorbell jingled as she stepped inside. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the usual rhythm resumed, cups clinking, pages turning, music humming low. "I saw the shop online," she said, eyes scanning the space like a stranger in a museum. "I know," I replied, my voice calm. "Certain. What can I get you?" She blinked. Caught off guard. "You're serving me?" "I serve everyone here," I said with a soft smile. "It's kind of the point." She glanced toward the pastries, then back at me. "Can we talk?" I nodded toward the small bench near the window. "I have 5 minutes." She sat, awkwardly, hands folded in her lap like a student at confession. "I was angry," she started. "That day, Christmas." "I didn't mean." "You did," I interrupted gently. "And it's okay. You said what you meant. I just finally believed you." Amanda stared at the floor, the weight of our history settling between us like a heavy coat neither of us wanted to pick up. "I miss you," she whispered. "I miss who I used to be with you," I said. Before I knew what it cost. Silence again. This time not hostile, but truthful. "I don't want anything from you," she said, standing slowly. "I just wanted to see what it looked like. You being happy." I smiled. Not to comfort her, but because I was. "I hope one day," I said, "you build something that makes you feel the same." She left without coffee, without closure, but also without drama, and I stood behind my counter whole, because not every story needs to be resolved. Some just need to be witnessed. Amanda didn't return, and I didn't wait. That encounter, brief as it was, marked a quiet turning in the soil of my life. The roots I'd planted, care, purpose, solitude, had taken hold. I was no longer tending a garden for someone else's harvest. I was blooming for myself. The hearth celebrated its 3rd month with a community book swap. The turnout stunned me. Not just locals, but travelers who'd followed our story online. A mother and daughter from Maine brought a bundle of dog-eared mysteries. A couple from Toronto left behind a love poem scribbled in the margins of a novel. People don't just bring books here, I realized. They bring parts of themselves they're ready to let go of. I often think about how much I held on to before, apologies never given, love never earned, approval never granted. I once believed those were the things that tethered me to family. Now I know better. A few days after the swap, a woman about my age walked into the shop. Her eyes were rimmed in red. She held a copy of Jane Eyre in one hand and a crumpled tissue in the other. "I heard this is a place for people who've had to start over," she said softly. "It is," I replied, setting down my pen. She told me a little of her story, abandoned in a divorce, left with a lease she couldn't break and a heart full of promises that had expired. I made her a tea I called Resilience, chamomile, mint, a touch of orange peel, and sat with her while she drank it. When she left, she turned at the door and said, "I didn't know how much I needed to be seen until someone looked." That night, I locked up and stood in the middle of the shop, lights dimmed, hands pressed to my heart. They once called me invisible. Now I illuminate. Not with rage or vengeance or even triumph, but with the quiet certainty that I am no longer surviving on scraps of kindness. I am feasting at the table I built myself. And I've left the door open not for them, necessarily, but for anyone still wandering in the dark, looking for a hearth to rest beside. The summer heat softened into September's golden hush, and the hearth found its rhythm. Not just as a cafe, but as a sanctuary, a refuge for the tender-hearted, the misfit, the weary. I'd long ago stopped expecting my family to walk through the door again. And yet, one Wednesday afternoon, I looked up from rearranging a display of autumn-themed books, and there she was. Mom. She looked older than I remembered. Her hair grayer, her posture stooped just enough to reveal the years I had missed, years she had never invited me into. She clutched a small handbag like a shield and wore the same perfume I remembered from childhood, lilac and starch. I didn't freeze. I didn't rush to her either. I simply stood there and let her come to me. "Hi," she said, voice thin as gauze. "I wasn't sure if I should come. But I saw your name in the paper. The article about your shop." I nodded. "You look well." "I've had better years," she replied, a sad smile tugging at her mouth. "Amanda moved to Arizona. Said she needed distance. I didn't realize until she was gone how much you carried." There it was. Not a grand apology, not redemption, but something true. "Why now?" I asked softly. She looked around the shop, at the shelves, the plants, the art on the walls from local students. "Because I wanted to see where you learned to love yourself," she said. "Because I never taught you." Her voice broke on the last word. I didn't reach for her, but I didn't look away. She asked for tea, and I made it lavender and chamomile with honey. We sat across from one another, the silence not sharp anymore, just quiet. She talked about the garden she'd let die, the way the house echoed now, and the guilt that kept her up at night. I listened, not to absolve her, but to witness her, the way I had longed to be witnessed. When she left, she hugged me, hesitant, soft. And this time, I didn't go rigid. I let her hold me for a second longer than necessary, then let go. As the door jingled shut behind her, I turned to my counter and wiped it down, each circle of the cloth like a ritual of return, not to them, but to myself. They might never become the family I needed, but I had become the woman I was meant to be. And that was enough. The days after Mom's visit passed in a kind of emotional afterglow, not grief, not relief, but a strange synthesis of both. I wasn't waiting for anything from her anymore. Not love in the form I'd always craved. Not repair that came too late to matter. What she gave me, in her own broken way, was confirmation. I hadn't imagined it. The neglect, the favoritism, the slow erosion of self-worth masquerading as family tradition, it had happened. And it wasn't mine to carry anymore. Autumn deepened, bringing with it the scent of apples and pine, the crunch of leaves, and a flood of new regulars. The Hearth's open mic nights expanded into storytelling circles, and local musicians offered to play acoustic sets on weekends. I started a book club for women navigating estrangement, grief, and rebirth. We called it the uninvited. It grew faster than I expected. Women of all ages, some who hadn't spoken to their mothers in decades, others just days removed from their last disappointment. We shared tears, tea, and truths that had long been buried beneath duty and politeness. One evening, during our circle, I shared something I hadn't voiced aloud before. I used to think that love meant giving until there was nothing left, I said. But I've learned that real love, healthy love, lets you keep some for yourself. A hush fell over the group. Then one woman, widowed young and silenced for years by in-laws who had judged her every decision, whispered, "Yes. Yes, it does." Later that night, I stood by the front window, watching headlights flicker past like memories I no longer chased. I realized then that I had inherited something after all, not from my family, but from my own resilience. I had inherited peace, a home of my own making, a voice I no longer questioned, and a quiet strength that no one could repossess. That night, I left the shop lights on a little longer than usual. Not because I was waiting, but because I was here. Fully. Finally, I started waking up before dawn, not out of obligation, but anticipation. There was something sacred in the stillness of those early hours, when the sky blushed and the world hadn't yet asked for anything. I would brew my first cup of coffee, open the windows just enough to let in the breeze, and sit at the small writing desk I had tucked into the back corner of the hearth. The desk had once belonged to a retired librarian who donated it with a simple note: "May new stories be born here." And they were. Not just mine. People left folded letters in the donation jar. Notes to lost lovers, estranged siblings, childhood friends who had vanished without goodbye. I started collecting them in a small box marked unsent but not unspoken. One day, I found a letter addressed to the one who stayed too long. It read, "I kept feeding the fire, thinking it was warmth, not realizing it was burning me. Thank you for reminding me I can walk away and still be whole." There was no signature, no return address, but I kept it beside my register. A talisman of truth. On Sundays, I started closing the shop early. Not for rest, but for creation. I picked up painting again. I covered one wall in soft canvases, seascapes, stormy skies, single windows illuminated in the night. They were mine. No one critiqued their practicality. No one asked what they were for. One customer asked if they were for sale. "No," I said. "They're for staying." Because that was something I'd never been taught, that not everything needed to earn its place through usefulness. Some things, some people, were worthy simply because they were. In October, I hosted the first found family supper. Everyone brought a dish and a story. There was laughter, tears, and so much warmth it fogged the windows. As I looked around that evening, I realized I had built the thing I needed most when I was growing up, a room where no one had to earn their seat. A place where belonging wasn't conditional. And I had done it without them. Without my mother's approval. Without Amanda's acceptance. Without permission. Sometimes healing doesn't look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like creation. I once believed redemption had to arrive in grand gestures, a confession, an apology, a reversal of the damage done. But life, I've learned, is built more on subtle shifts than cinematic moments. One such shift came quietly in November, a letter tucked into my mailbox beneath a flyer for a hardware store sale. The return address was unfamiliar. Inside was a short note. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted to say I see what you've made. And it's beautiful. You always had that in you. Dad." No warmth, no signature of affection. But still, it was more than I ever thought I'd receive. I held it in my hands for a long time, not knowing if I should cry or laugh. In the end, I did neither. I placed it in the same box where I kept the stories from strangers, a small archive of pain transmuted into proof. Proof that even shadows shift in the right light. Around that time, I also received my business's first review in a major city magazine. They called The Hearth a refuge disguised as a cafe, built by someone who understands what it means to be overlooked. I reread that line until it settled in my bones. People came in daily now, not for coffee alone, but for conversation, for connection. We had a wall labeled "The Lost and Found" not for items, but for memories, notes, apologies, small offerings of the self. One child left a crayon drawing of a woman with curly hair, arms open wide. Beneath the words, "She made me feel safe." It's framed in my office now. Because there was a time no one framed me. This was how I learned that enough doesn't come from someone else's mouth. It's something you declare for yourself. One morning, as I wiped the counters and prepped for another day, I whispered aloud, "This is enough." The shop. My peace. My place in the world. No spotlight. No applause. Just the quiet certainty that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Especially not the ones who had only ever seen me through the lens of their own lack. By December, the first snow returned, as soft and unassuming as the silence that had once defined me. But this time, I wasn't buried beneath it. I walked through it, head high, coat open to the cold, welcoming the weight of winter as something earned. The hearth shimmered in string lights and paper stars, hand-cut by local kids who gathered for cocoa and crafts. Our warm words wall now overflowed with handwritten notes, memories, secrets, dreams, some as short as a sentence, others spilling across 3 pages. One simply read, "I thought I was alone until I sat here." I knew what they meant. Every once in a while, people would ask me why I never wrote a letter back to my mother. Why I never returned Amanda's last text. The answer was always the same. Some bridges are better left unlit. Not burned. Just untraveled. There is grace in the choice not to re-enter a fire just because you've grown flameproof. This Christmas, for the first time in years, I didn't dread the season. I didn't overcompensate or host out of guilt. Instead, I baked for the shop, made mulled wine, and watched strangers become friends over shared warmth and gingerbread crumbs. On Christmas Eve, I sat alone by the window with a book and a single candle. Not lonely, not longing, just present. Outside, the snow painted the streets in forgiveness. Inside, the flicker of flame danced over the walls I had built not to keep people out, but to shelter myself in. That night, I finally understood what it meant to feel at home without needing to be claimed by anyone but myself. My old life still whispered sometimes, from old corners of memory, from half-healed places. But now I answered those voices not with sorrow or yearning, but with this simple truth. I stayed. I stayed for myself. And I was never a loser. I was the architect of survival. And now, the keeper of my own peace, the new year arrived quietly, without spectacle or promise. Just a soft hush of snow outside the windows, the warm breath of steam rising from mugs, and the comforting ritual of opening the hearth at dawn. I marked the first day of January with a small act of reverence. I wrote a letter. Not to my family. Not to anyone who had ever left me. But to myself. Dear me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not folding when the weight was too much, for waking up in houses that didn't see you, and still dreaming of one that would. Thank you for not waiting for applause before you chose yourself. You didn't become cold. You became clear. I folded the letter and slipped it into the drawer beneath my cash register, a reminder that the most sacred witness to our lives is often our own eyes. By mid-January, the hearth had become something of a gathering place for more than just regulars. We started hosting workshops, writing circles, grief journaling, small business mentoring. People brought their broken bits, and we stitched them together in laughter and empathy. One woman, Judith, had lost her husband of 40 years and arrived every Friday with a new story and the same thermos. She once said, "I come here because it reminds me that being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely." And I nodded, understanding more than she knew. The town's paper published a follow-up feature on the shop, a home for the unheard. They included a quote from me that I barely remembered giving. The best thing I ever did was stop waiting for my family to love me the way I loved them. When I started loving myself like that, everything changed. Amanda saw the article. I know because she sent a message, just a single line. I wish I had understood that sooner. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, but because I was whole. Forgiveness had already bloomed in me like spring beneath snow. But healing doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it just requires release. And I was ready. Ready to live, to lead, to light the path, not for those who had abandoned me, but for the girl I once was, standing at the window with a smile she didn't yet know was armor. She was the one I was coming home to after all this time. February came with longer stretches of daylight, subtle and sure. It reminded me of how healing had arrived in my life, not suddenly, but by degrees, like the slow thaw of ice over still water. I began to notice things I had once overlooked. The way my laughter filled the shop and made others turn, smiling. The ease with which I now said no. The gentleness I extended to myself on days when memories pulled harder than usual. And in those quiet recognitions, I discovered something I never expected to feel again, joy that wasn't borrowed from someone else's approval. One Friday afternoon, a young woman stepped inside the hearth, drenched from rain and clutching a torn folder. She looked around, eyes scanning the room like she was searching for an exit, but then she spotted the warm words wall. She walked over, read 3 notes, and burst into tears. I approached her slowly, offering a tissue and a smile. "I don't know why I'm crying," she said. I think I've been carrying so much for so long." I led her to a table in the corner, brought her tea on the house, and let her sit in silence. She returned the next day, then again, and again. Weeks later, she left a note on the wall. Here, I found the version of myself I thought I'd buried. Thank you. I kept that one. Folded it into the pages of the same journal where I had once written my story of betrayal. Now it held stories of rebuilding. This was the quiet justice no one warned me about. Not revenge, not regret, but renewal. Amanda never called again. Mom sent a birthday card in March. No return address. Just a pressed daisy between the pages. I understood the gesture. I didn't respond. Because closure, I'd come to realize, is a myth. But peace? Peace is a decision. And I made it every morning as I turned the sign to open, brewed the first cup, and welcomed whoever needed a place to remember their own worth. I didn't need them to come back. Because I had never truly left myself, spring announced itself with soft rains and crocuses sprouting defiantly through the frost. The hearth's front garden, once barren and overlooked, bloomed with herbs and wildflowers donated by neighbors who had, over time, become kin. I stood in that garden one morning, dirt on my hands and sunlight on my back, and thought, this is what stays. Not the hurt, not the silence, not even the absence of those who once defined my worth by how much I could give. What stayed was the peace in my chest, the clarity in my choices, the love I had cultivated not from obligation, but intention. One evening, during a storytelling circle, someone asked, "What would you tell your younger self?" The room fell still. I didn't hesitate. I would tell her that love is not a transaction. That her worth is not in how well she endures mistreatment, but in how fiercely she protects her own heart. I'd tell her she is not selfish for wanting space. She's sacred for building it. The group was silent for a beat. Then came the soft sound of someone exhaling, like a release they'd waited years to allow. That night, I stayed after closing, wiping tables and humming an old tune I didn't realize I remembered. I caught my reflection in the window, older, yes, but softer too. Not from breaking, but from blossoming. Amanda's voice had long faded from my dreams. My mother's disapproval no longer echoed in my quiet moments. What remained was mine. The books lining the walls. The laughter that filled the air like music. The strangers turned confidants, who spoke in truths too tender to carry alone. And most of all, me. Not the version shaped by their expectations, but the one I had chiseled from years of silence and sacrifice. The one who stayed when no one else did. The one who opened the window, heard the worst of it, and smiled anyway, because she already knew who she was. And she was never coming undone again. The hearth's anniversary fell on a bright April morning, the kind of day that made you believe in beginnings. 1 year. 12 months of unlearning, of building, of holding space for others and for myself. We celebrated simply. No speeches. No banners. Just good food, warm drinks, and an open mic that overflowed with poetry, songs, and quiet testimonies that made the walls feel like they were listening. A woman I barely knew stood near the front with a mug in both hands. She waited until the last guest had left to approach me. "I came here after my divorce," she said. "I didn't talk to anyone for weeks. But your barista remembered my name the second time I came in." And I cried all the way home because I realized I hadn't heard my name spoken with kindness in months. She paused. "This place gave me back myself." I reached for her hand and squeezed it. "Me too," I whispered. Later that night, I sat alone beneath the soft glow of the reading nook lamp. I took out my old journal, the one where I had first written about the Christmas betrayal, about the window and the voices and the smile that wasn't joy but armor. I read every word, not to reopen wounds, but to witness the distance I had traveled from them. At the end of the last page, I added a final entry. They never saw me. Not really. But I did. I do. And I always will. I closed the book gently and placed it on the highest shelf in the shop, spine facing out, among titles about survival and grace. Not for sale. Not for anyone else. Just there. A reminder that belonging isn't found in a seat at someone else's table. It's found in the room you build when you finally decide to stop asking for entry. And my room, the hearth, was full. Sometimes, just before closing, I catch a glimpse of myself reflected in the glass, the same window that once framed the moment everything changed. The day I overheard them outside. Their laughter. Their plans. Their dismissal. That version of me, the one inside the kitchen, slicing roast, arranging plates, wearing a smile as armor, still lives somewhere in memory. But she's not alone anymore. She has become a story I carry, not a cage I live in. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled low in the distance and the cafe lights flickered gently, a girl about 16 wandered in, soaked to the bone. She looked lost, not directionally, but emotionally. Her eyes scanned the room like she wasn't sure whether she was welcome. She ordered tea in a whisper and sat at a table near the window. I brought it to her myself. "Rain's heavy today," I said softly. She nodded, blinking fast. It wasn't supposed to be. I wasn't supposed to be here. I sat across from her, just for a moment. Some of the best places I've ever ended up started with a wrong turn. She looked at me then, really looked, and asked, "How do you know who to trust when everyone wants something?" I paused. I don't look at what they want. I look at how they treat me when I say no. She stared down into her cup, then said, "I think I said yes too many times." "Me too," I said. She stayed for hours, reading, writing in her notebook. Before she left, she tucked something into the warm words wall. Later, I found it. She didn't fix me. She didn't even try. She just saw me. And I think that might be the beginning. I pinned it to the center of the wall, right below my own first note. The hearth wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a place where the girl at the window finally opened the door. And she wasn't serving dinner to those who mocked her. She was serving truth, warmth, and the kind of silence that heals instead of hides. Some people think healing is a loud process, a dramatic break, a triumphant return. But for me, it was more like replacing broken tiles in a mosaic. Quiet work. Slow work. Work that no one applauds until the light hits just right. One day in May, while sorting through a box of old receipts and shop papers, I found my birth certificate. Folded neatly, still bearing the faint scent of cedar from the drawer it had lived in for years. Emma Louise Clark. I stared at the name for a long time. It wasn't shame I felt, nor bitterness. Just distance. Like looking at a coat I no longer wore but couldn't quite donate. That name had carried me through 1,000 small deaths, of dreams, of self-worth, of belonging. And yet, it also carried the weight of survival, of staying when no one noticed, of loving in silence. But I wasn't her anymore. Not fully. The next week, I applied for a legal name change. Not to sever ties with my past, but to bless the woman I had become. E.L. Hart. Heart, short for hearth, for heat, for heart. For the place I built when no one came to save me. I didn't tell anyone at first. I wanted the name to feel mine before the world tried to shape it. When the change became official, I updated the shop's documents quietly. The sign still read The Hearth, but now the soul behind it stood taller, sharper, whole. One afternoon, a customer asked what the initials stood for. Everything I had to become, I said with a smile. She didn't ask more. And I didn't owe her the story. Some names we outgrow. Some we reclaim. And some we choose not because they erase who we were, but because they honor who we fought to be. Summer rolled in on the backs of warm winds and thunderstorms, nature's way of reminding us that even growth needs breaking skies. Business at the hearth remained steady, but something deeper was shifting in me. Not loss. Not longing. A clarity I hadn't known to ask for. I started spending more time alone, not because I was retreating, but because solitude had become sacred. I would take long evening walks. After closing the cafe, the city quiet around me, the rhythm of my steps like prayer. It was during one of these walks that I passed the old hardware store my father once dreamed of franchising. It had closed the year before, a victim of big box chains and time. Its windows were papered over now, its sign faded and cracked. I stood there for a while, just breathing. There had been a time I would have mourned it, not the business, but the myth it represented. The family legacy I was supposed to uphold. The future I was meant to inherit through obedience and silence. But now all I felt was release. That dream had never been mine. And my father had never truly seen me beyond its shadow. Still, I whispered, I forgive you, into the still air, not because he asked, not because he deserved it, but because I was done carrying the weight of his disappointment like it was my inheritance. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not letting someone off the hook. It's unhooking yourself from the story they tried to write you into. When I returned to the hearth, I lit every candle in the room. Not for ambience. For ritual. And then I wrote one more note for the warm words wall. Your healing is not a betrayal. It's a becoming. By morning, it was already surrounded by others, echoes of liberation, from voices that had once trembled and now rang clear. I had become the woman who no longer feared being misunderstood. Because I had finally come home. To myself did as July deepened, so did the sense of expansion, not outward, but inward. Like a house that reveals secret rooms only when you stop rushing through it. I began carving space for things I once considered luxuries. Naps in the middle of the day, books read for no reason, meals made slowly just for me. Joy stopped needing justification. One morning, while organizing a donation shelf, I found an old copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. The pages were yellowed, the cover soft from use. A small inscription inside read, To Lila, because being real is never easy, but always worth it. Love, Aunt Evie. I sat down right there on the floor and read it from beginning to end. When I finished, I wept not from sadness, but from recognition. That book, like so many things in my life, had waited patiently to be seen. And now that I could see clearly, everything felt more alive. Even the pain. Even the parts of me still learning how to stay. That evening, I led a writing circle titled Letters to Our Former Selves. One woman read hers aloud. You were not hard to love. They just didn't know how. Another wrote, You don't have to audition for affection anymore. When it was my turn, I hesitated. Then I said, You did everything right. Even when no one clapped. Even when they called it wrong. The room was silent after that, not from discomfort, but reverence. We were no longer hiding behind resilience. We were living through it. That night, I lit the candle in my window again. Not for Amanda. Not for my mother. Just for the girl I used to be, the one who once waited behind curtains, who set the table, who kept smiling through the sting of exclusion. She deserved a light. And I would be the one to keep it burning. August arrived with warm winds and golden sunsets, the kind that spilled over the hearth's windows like honey. The shop moved slower in the heat, but the conversations deepened. People lingered longer, let their silences stretch, trusted each other with heavier truths. One afternoon, I found a folded paper left behind on the windowsill. No name, no signature. Just this. I used to think I was broken. But maybe I was just building. Thank you for the blueprint. I pressed it flat and added it to the wall. That evening, a musician who often played during our open mic nights brought a cello. As she tuned it, she said, "I thought the cello was too heavy to carry again. But I heard this place holds things gently." She played a low, mournful piece that vibrated through the floor and into my chest. People sat still, eyes closed, letting the sound do what words often couldn't. And in that moment, I thought of all the things I had carried. The debt I shouldn't have taken on. The shame of always needing to prove I was enough. The silence that wrapped itself around my childhood like insulation, meant to protect but suffocating all the same. Now I carried none of it. Only peace. Only purpose. Only the knowledge that I had become a place people came to feel less alone. Later that week, I received a letter from a former client. I had helped her plan her finances 2 years ago, back when I was still trying to impress people who dismissed me. She wrote, "You didn't just fix my numbers. You gave me language for freedom." That's what this place was. Freedom with form. Healing with structure. A song played in quiet rooms and echoed long after the last note. I no longer needed anyone to return and say, "You were right," because I had never needed their permission to begin with. Only my own. And I had finally, blessedly, given it.